The air over the Gulf of Salerno in the early days of September 1943 carried the heavy metallic scent of saltwater cordite and the impending friction of industrial warfare. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, the pragmatic and battle-hardened commander of the German 10th Army, stood overlooking the crescent-shaped coastline from an elevated command post nestled within the rugged foothills of the Apennine Mountains. Below him, the Tyrrhenian Sea was no longer the serene azure expanse of the Italian summer but a congested churning staging ground for the largest amphibious invasion the Allies had yet attempted in the European theater. Operation Avalanche, the Anglo-American landing at Salerno, was designed to be a decisive thrust into the soft underbelly of Axis-occupied Europe. However, Vietinghoff, analyzing the topography with the cold calculating eye of a Prussian staff officer, knew that Salerno was anything but soft. The geography of the bay formed a natural amphitheater, a narrow coastal plain bordered by a crescent of imposing mountains that offered the defenders perfectly concealed observation posts and interlocking fields of overlapping artillery fire. It was a kill zone. Vietinghoff had methodically positioned the veteran elements of the 16th Panzer Division supported by the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division to exploit this terrain. His objective was not merely to contest the landing but to allow the American Fifth Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark, to commit its forces to the shallow beachhead and then launch a concentrated armored counterattack that would split the Allied forces and drive them violently back into the sea. The strategic premise of the German defense relied on a fundamental tenet of land warfare which dictated that an amphibious force is at its most vulnerable precisely when it is attempting to transition from sea to land, bridging the chaotic interval between naval transport and organized ground combat. When the Allied infantry waded ashore on September 9, they intentionally did so without a preliminary naval bombardment, hoping to achieve tactical surprise. Vietinghoff viewed this decision as a fatal miscalculation. The German gunners, concealed in the terraced hillsides and concrete bunkers, poured a withering volume of machine gun and mortar fire into the landing craft, while 88mm anti-aircraft guns, depressed to fire horizontally, shattered the specialized amphibious vehicles before they could even lower their ramps. Despite horrific casualties, the American and British infantry managed to claw their way onto the beaches of Paestum and Maiori, establishing a tenuous perimeter that stretched thinly along the coastline. But Vietinghoff remained unbothered by this initial lodgment. He understood that infantry alone could not hold the plain against massed armor. He bided his time, allowing the Allied logistical train to bottleneck on the contested sand, while his Panzer Grenadiers slowly yielded ground trading space for time, drawing the enemy deeper into the geographical trap. By September 13, the situation for the Allied forces had deteriorated to a state of profound crisis. A critical seam had developed in the Allied line along the banks of the Selle River, a muddy waterway that served as the operational boundary between the British 10th Corps to the north and the American 6th Corps to the south. This gap, expanding to nearly 5 miles in width, presented a catastrophic vulnerability. Vietinghoff, recognizing the precise moment of maximum Allied disorganization, unleashed the full combined weight of his armored reserves. The German counterattack was a masterpiece of combined arms doctrine. Formations of Panzer IV medium tanks supported by heavily armored self-propelled assault guns and mechanized infantry surged through the Selle River corridor. Their objective was clear: to sever the beachhead in two, isolate the British and American corps, and systematically annihilate them against the waterline. The American infantry, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons and exhausted from 4 days of continuous combat, found themselves facing a mechanized onslaught they could not effectively halt. The German armor advanced with methodical brutality, overrunning forward observation posts, crushing machine gun nests, and driving deep into the rear echelon areas of the American 6th Corps. As the German spearheads pushed toward the vital road junction at Battipaglia and the high ground around Altavilla, Vietinghoff received reports of unmitigated success. The Allied perimeter was collapsing. Command posts were being overrun. Supply dumps were burning. General Clark, anticipating a complete disaster, had even begun to draw up contingency plans for a full evacuation of the beachhead. The German tank commanders, operating miles inland and shielded from the sea by rolling hills and dense olive groves, felt secure in their tactical dominance. They were operating well beyond the effective range of the Allied field artillery that had been landed, and they believed the coastal terrain masked their movements from the naval vessels anchored in the bay. In the traditional mathematics of armored warfare, the Germans held the overwhelming advantage in mass mobility and localized firepower. But as the 16th Panzer Division marshaled its forces for the final crushing blow against the American lines, they were about to encounter a terrifying paradigm shift in the application of military force. They were about to be subjected to an unprecedented volume of invisible fire originating from platforms they could not see, directed by observers they could not hear. The mechanism of their impending destruction was floating silently in the deep waters of the Gulf of Salerno. The Allied naval commanders, realizing the desperate plight of the ground forces, had ordered every available cruiser and destroyer to close the shoreline and provide continuous, unrestricted naval gunfire support. The United States Navy deployed a squadron of light cruisers including the USS Savannah, the USS Philadelphia, and the USS Boise, while the Royal Navy positioned the cruisers HMS Mauritius, HMS Uganda, and HMS Orion alongside a flotilla of aggressive fleet destroyers. These vessels were not merely ships, they were highly mobile, heavily armored artillery batteries capable of delivering a volume of high-explosive ordnance that no land-based artillery regiment could possibly match. A Brooklyn-class cruiser like the USS Savannah was armed with 15 6-inch 47 caliber guns arranged in 5 triple turrets. These weapons, firing automatically rammed 50-pound powder charges behind 130-pound high-explosive projectiles, sending them out of the barrels at velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. A single cruiser could sustain a rate of fire of nearly 150 rounds per minute, blanketing a target area with thousands of pounds of shrapnel and blast overpressure in a matter of seconds. But the sheer mechanical power of these naval rifles was useless without precise targeting data. The German armored formations were assembling in defilades and valleys completely obscured from the visual line of sight of the ships in the bay. To bridge this critical gap, the Allies deployed a sophisticated network of forward observers. On the ground, naval liaison officers carrying heavy radio sets crawled to the crests of the contested hills, risking enemy sniper fire to establish visual contact with the German staging areas. Simultaneously, the airspace above the battlefield was populated by specialized naval spotter aircraft. Slow-flying Supermarine Seafires and Curtiss Society Seagull floatplanes, catapulted from the decks of the cruisers, circled high above the smoke and dust of the front lines. These aviators, flying completely unarmed and highly vulnerable to German fighter patrols, acted as the eyes of the fleet. They observed the massive columns of German armor churning up the dust of the coastal roads and instantly translated those visual observations into complex mathematical coordinates based on standardized military grid reference systems. The communication loop between the airborne spotters and the naval gunners was a marvel of mid-century analog engineering. The pilot would transmit the grid coordinates and a brief description of the target via highly scrambled, very high-frequency radio signals. These signals were received by the plotting rooms buried deep within the armored citadels of the cruisers. Inside these sweltering steel compartments, teams of highly trained fire control technicians fed the coordinates into electromechanical analog computers known as rangekeepers. The rangekeeper was not a digital device but an incredibly complex arrangement of gears, cams, and servomotors designed to solve real-time ballistic differential equations. The technicians inputted a dizzying array of variables to ensure absolute accuracy. They factored in the exact distance to the target, the speed and course of the ship, the temperature of the smokeless powder, the ambient humidity, the barometric pressure, the rotational effect of the Earth known as the Coriolis drift, and even the microscopic wear on the rifling inside the gun barrels from previous shots. Once the rangekeeper digested these variables, it transmitted continuous electrical signals directly to the gun turrets, automatically elevating and traversing the massive steel cannons to the precise mathematical angle required to deliver the shells over the intervening mountains and directly onto the German positions. The synchronization was absolute. When the command to fire was given, the ship would shudder violently as tons of propellant ignited simultaneously. For the German soldiers of the 16th Panzer Division advancing confidently through the Selle River Gap, the arrival of this ordnance was an incomprehensible apocalypse. They were accustomed to the rhythmic, predictable nature of field artillery, which required time to register targets and adjust fire. Naval gunfire possessed no such rhythm. Because the shells were traveling at supersonic speeds, they arrived entirely without warning. The air would suddenly split apart with the deafening shriek of displaced atmosphere, followed a fraction of a second later by a cataclysmic series of detonations that tore the earth open. General Vietinghoff, receiving frantic radio transmissions from his frontline commanders, struggled to comprehend the scale of the destruction being reported. Entire companies of panzer grenadiers assembling in supposedly secure rear areas were being vaporized in seconds. The 6-inch high-explosive shells equipped with super quick-point detonating fuses did not bury themselves in the dirt before exploding. They detonated at the exact millimeter of contact with the ground or the canopy of the olive trees, sending horizontal scythes of jagged steel fragments tearing through the vulnerable sides of half-tracks and the unarmored supply trucks. The sheer kinetic energy of a naval shell striking a medium tank like a Panzer IV was enough to shatter the armored chassis, dismount the turret, and instantly incinerate the crew within, regardless of whether the shell actually penetrated the armor plate. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German veterans of the Eastern Front who had endured the massive artillery barrages of the Soviet Red Army reported that they had never experienced anything comparable to the sheer density and relentless accuracy of the Allied naval bombardment at Salerno. The invisible fire paralyzed the German counterattack. Every time a German armored column attempted to maneuver down a road or deploy into a combat formation, an airborne spotter would relay the movement, and within 3 minutes a devastating concentration of naval artillery would obliterate the coordinate. The precision was surgical. American forward observers called in fire missions within 200 yards of their own defensive lines, trusting the absolute mathematical accuracy of the naval gunners to break up the German infantry assaults. The U.S. Sixth Corps, which hours earlier had been on the verge of a catastrophic collapse, suddenly found its front lines protected by an impenetrable curtain of high-explosive steel dropping from the sky. The German thrust down the Selle River corridor, which Vietinghoff had relied upon to split the beachhead, was violently blunted. The burned-out husks of German armor and shattered transport vehicles littered the valley floors, standing as silent testaments to the lethal reach of sea power projecting deep inland. But the nightmare for the German 10th Army was only beginning. The cruisers and destroyers had stabilized the perimeter, but the Allied High Command, determined to permanently break the German will to resist, called upon the ultimate arbiters of naval destruction. On the morning of September 14th, as the German infantry attempted to regroup under the relentless 6-inch barrage, 2 massive silhouettes appeared on the horizon. They were the British Queen Elizabeth-class battleships HMS Warspite and HMS Valiant, veterans of the First World War that had been extensively modernized to serve as the heavy hammers of the Royal Navy. Their arrival shifted the scale of the bombardment from tactical interdiction to strategic annihilation. Unlike the cruisers, which relied on volume of fire, the battleships delivered localized earthquakes. Each vessel was armed with 8 15-inch Mark I naval guns firing projectiles that weighed 1,920 pounds, roughly the weight of a small automobile. The operational employment of these massive weapons required entirely different ballistic considerations. The 15-inch shells, propelled by 428 pounds of cordite, traveled at over 2,400 feet per second and reached maximum altitudes of thousands of feet before plunging back to Earth on a steep parabolic trajectory. This plunging fire was specifically designed to defeat heavily fortified concrete bunkers and the thick deck armor of enemy dreadnoughts, but when applied to soft ground targets, the results were apocalyptic. When a 15-inch high-explosive shell struck the Italian soil, it did not merely fragment, it excavated. The detonation created craters 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, displacing hundreds of tons of earth and rock in a single microsecond. The concussive overpressure generated by the blast wave was sufficient to rupture the internal organs of infantrymen sheltering in deep trenches hundreds of feet from the epicenter of the explosion. As Vietinghoff desperately attempted to reinforce the battered remnants of the 16th Panzer Division holding the critical high ground around the village of Altavilla, the British battleships received their firing coordinates. The village, sitting atop a commanding ridge, was heavily garrisoned by German troops preparing for a renewed assault on the American lines. The spotter planes verified the target, and the massive rangekeepers aboard Warspite and Valiant calculated the firing solution. When the battleships unleashed their broadsides, the concussion was felt miles inland. The massive shells arced over the Gulf of Salerno, invisible to the naked eye until the very moment of impact. The bombardment of Altavilla was a display of mechanized violence that defied human comprehension. Entire stone buildings that had stood for centuries were pulverized into fine gray dust in a single strike. German armored vehicles caught in the blast radius were thrown through the air like discarded toys, their heavily armored hulls crushed by the sheer atmospheric pressure of the detonations. The strategic reality of the invisible fire finally broke the operational momentum of the German 10th Army. A general can maneuver his forces against an enemy, he can develop tactical countermeasures against tanks and infantry, he can even deploy anti-aircraft batteries to contest the skies. But Vietinghoff realized with a deep creeping sense of professional despair that he possessed absolutely no mechanism to counter the guns of the Allied fleet. His artillery could not range the ships anchored miles offshore. His Luftwaffe assets were heavily outnumbered and unable to penetrate the Allied combat air patrols to strike the vessels, and his vaunted panzer divisions, the premier instrument of German operational maneuver, were being systematically slaughtered in their assembly areas without ever seeing the enemy that was destroying them. The traditional military geometry of the battlefield had been fundamentally altered. The coastline was no longer a flank that could be anchored, it was a porous membrane through which the Allies could project overwhelming unlimited firepower. By the evening of September 15, the grand German counteroffensive had completely stalled. The casualty reports flooding into Vietinghoff's headquarters were staggering. Elite infantry battalions had been reduced to the size of platoons. Panzer regiments had lost more than half their operational strength, not to American anti-tank guns or British tanks but to the relentless, highly accurate plunging fire from the sea. The fields and olive groves of the Salerno plain were pockmarked with thousands of overlapping craters, the earth scorched and churning from the continuous delivery of naval ordnance. The surviving German soldiers, severely demoralized by the unceasing bombardment and the inability to strike back, began to refer to the Allied naval guns as the invisible terror. The psychological toll of enduring days of random catastrophic explosions without the ability to seek effective cover or return fire shattered the combat cohesion of even the most experienced frontline units. Faced with the total collapse of his offensive capability and the very real threat of his entire army being trapped and annihilated within the coastal mountains, General Vietinghoff was forced to make a bitter strategic concession. He contacted Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the supreme German commander in Italy, and reported that the objective of driving the Allies into the sea was no longer attainable. The unyielding umbrella of naval artillery had created an artificial impenetrable fortress around the beachhead. With heavy losses and his logistical lines severely disrupted by the ongoing bombardment, Vietinghoff ordered a phased tactical withdrawal. The 10th Army would disengage from the Salerno plain and retreat northward, fighting a slow, bitter delaying action through the mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula. The grand trap had failed and the Allies had secured their vital foothold on the European mainland. The Battle of Salerno stands as a profound testament to the decisive strategic impact of naval gunfire support in modern amphibious operations. The German High Command, recognized for their operational brilliance and tactical flexibility on the ground, had been entirely outmatched by the application of advanced naval gunnery physics and integrated fire control networks. The realization that an entire armored division could be halted, decimated, and ultimately forced to retreat by artillery platforms floating out of sight over the horizon fundamentally altered how the German military planned defensive operations against future Allied landings. Never again would they attempt to mass their armor in the immediate coastal zones where the heavy guns of the cruisers and battleships could reach them. The invisible fire that rained down upon the 16th Panzer Division at Salerno proved definitively that control of the sea did not merely secure the supply lines, it provided a crushing, undeniable mastery over the adjacent land.